Long before colonial borders were drawn, before foreign laws and religions reshaped the continent, Africa held stories of love and desire that history often tried to erase. In kingdoms and villages across the land, same-sex relationships were not always hidden. They were practiced, ritualized, and in some cultures, even honored. From warrior societies that forged intimate bonds on the battlefield, to royal courts where male lovers held power and influence, the reality of pre-colonial Africa was far more complex than the silence left in today's textbooks. This is the History Outsiders rewrote, replacing acceptance with stigma and turning lived traditions into forbidden shadows. Tonight, we uncover what was buried. Drop the time you're watching this in the comments. I love seeing when my history travelers step into the story. And if discovering the hidden truths of the past excites you, subscribing is always your choice. But the next chapters are even more revealing. Picture this. You're sitting under a giant baobab tree, the kind whose branches look like they've been turned upside down and jammed into the sky, and someone starts singing an old tune in a language you don't fully know. At first, it sounds like just another village song, maybe about planting or rain or the moon. But if you keep listening, you notice something sly in the words, little hints and winks woven between the verses. That's where the story hides. The whispers tucked inside oral tradition, where same-sex love and companionship show up without ever being said directly. It's like watching a play where the audience is in on a secret, but the actors never say it out loud. These folk tales, chants, and proverbs carried more than just moral lessons. They carried coded histories, tiny breadcrumbs for anyone paying attention. You can almost hear the griot, the community storyteller, clearing his throat as the fire crackles. He begins to recount how two hunters, inseparable since boyhood, journeyed into the forest together and refused to marry women, choosing each other instead. To the casual listener, maybe it's just about brotherhood, but you lean in closer, and the details are too tender, too deliberate, too affectionate to ignore. Oral tradition in many African societies had that sly ability to say what needed to be said without ever spelling it out. Do you see how clever that is? It's like when your grandmother makes a joke that goes over the children's heads, but makes the adults chuckle knowingly. In the Kikuyu tradition of Kenya, you might hear stories of warriors who shared a hut and were honored for their loyalty to one another. It's easy to dismiss as friendship, but the repetition, the deliberate phrasing, and the way people nod knowingly gives it away. Oral tradition was never just about entertainment. It was an archive, a living library that held secrets safe from censors. And remember, this was long before colonial officials showed up with notebooks and pens ready to redefine what was normal. People relied on voice and memory, weaving human experience into songs and riddles that could pass from grandmother to child without leaving a trace of ink. Think about how, in modern times, we use memes. A simple picture with a caption can carry sarcasm, inside jokes, or even resistance against authority. You don't need to say it outright. The message spreads in code. That's not far from how pre-colonial African communities used songs and tales. Instead of memes, they had riddles. And instead of captions, they had clever wordplay. The underlying message was clear to those who knew the cultural script. And sometimes, that message included recognition of same-sex affection. Let's pull in a real example. In the Zonde people's stories from Central Africa, accounts survive of warriors who openly took younger male partners, training them in warfare while also forming intimate bonds. European colonizers later documented these practices with shock, but within the culture, they were no scandal. And before those Europeans wrote their biased notes, the stories already circulated orally, preserved in campfire talk, battle songs, and initiation rituals. When you realize this, you understand just how much of the past has been scrubbed clean by written histories that only started after outsiders arrived. Isn't it ironic? The things colonizers dismissed as primitive oral stories actually safeguarded truths that the so-called civilized record keepers tried to erase. Now imagine yourself at a wedding ceremony where the drummer suddenly beats a playful rhythm and a singer improvises lyrics about a woman preferring the company of another woman. The crowd laughs, some cheer, and the teasing becomes part of the celebration. Was it just humor? Or was it acknowledgement of something understood but rarely written down? Oral culture gave room for that ambiguity, serious but playful, teasing but truthful. It kept topics alive without turning them into scandal. And here's a thought. How many of these stories slipped away because they were never written? Oral traditions are fragile that way. If one generation forgets to pass them on, they vanish like smoke. But the ones that did survive, those whispers about same-sex companionship, about unusual bonds, prove that human diversity was always recognized in African societies, not invented later, not imported, but remembered all along in songs and sayings. Doesn't that make you wonder what else we've lost, simply because no one put it on paper? Let's end this stretch of the journey with a lighter image. Picture two elders chuckling under that baobab tree, trading lines from an old proverb about love that does not ask permission of gender. The children run around, none the wiser, but the adults hear the undertone. They keep the memory alive by laughing, repeating, and passing it on. That's how whispers survive the centuries. Not in libraries, but in laughter, in songs, in stories that carry meanings just a little too sharp to be coincidence. When you shift from the fireside stories of villagers to the polished walls of a royal court, the whispers become heavier, wrapped in gold and politics. Kings and chiefs weren't just figures of power. They were human beings with affections, preferences, and hidden entanglements that didn't always match the official narrative. You can almost picture a royal palace in Buganda, Uganda, in the 19th century. The air is thick with incense. Courtiers rush about with messages. And in the middle of it all sits King Mwanga II. History remembers him for clashing with missionaries and colonial forces, but tucked into those records is another detail. He openly kept male pages as companions and lovers. That's not gossip. It's documented by the very missionaries who tried to convert him. Their shocked journals reveal more than they intended, like when someone complains so much that they accidentally give you the clearest picture of reality. It wasn't just Buganda. Across different societies, chiefs and rulers formed bonds with men of their court or women of their entourage in ways that defied the expected blueprint. And yet, within their own cultures, these behaviors weren't always condemned. Instead, they were folded into the complex fabric of leadership. Think of it like how modern celebrities' private lives still fascinate us today. People talk, speculate, and sometimes exaggerate, but the presence of those relationships, no matter how whispered about, was undeniable. Imagine a royal feast. Drums pounding, dancers circling, and guests piling their plates high with roasted meat. Somewhere in that chaos, the chief's favorite advisor slips into the hall. Everyone notices the way they exchange a glance, the familiarity that's just a shade warmer than protocol allows. Nobody names it out loud, but the unspoken truth floats there, like candle smoke. And here's the clever part. Oral history often preserved those details with sly commentary. A song might poke fun at a chief's preference, or a satirical play might exaggerate the relationship for laughs. But under the humor, the memory stayed intact. Take the story of Shaka Zulu, the famed 19th century warrior king of the Zulu. Historians still argue about whether his strict military regiments, where men lived closely together and delayed marriage, created space for same-sex bonds. Some scholars hint at it, others dismiss it, but the question itself shows how little we've truly examined the private lives of rulers. If your image of Shaka is just a man with a spear yelling on a battlefield, you're missing the human side. The side that, like anyone else, sought intimacy and connection in ways that didn't always fit the neat categories outsiders later imposed. You might be wondering, how did subjects react when their king or chief showed favor to a same-sex partner? Did they rebel or gossip endlessly? In many cases, loyalty to power was stronger than private judgment. When your entire livelihood depends on pleasing the ruler, do you really care whom he invites into his chamber? It's like working for a boss today. You might have your opinions, but if keeping quiet means keeping your job, discretion becomes second nature. Royal courts weren't democratic spaces of open critique. They were bubbles, where silence was often the safest option. Let's pull in a modern comparison. Think about how tabloids treat politicians today. Scandals break, rumors swirl, and everyone scrambles to decide whether it matters for leadership. Now, strip away the printing presses and the Twitter feeds, and place that same energy into a royal drum circle, where gossip spreads through songs and satire instead of headlines. The dynamic isn't that different. Leaders were always under scrutiny, and their private choices often became the stuff of legend, whether in admiration, mockery, or whispered acknowledgement. The Ashanti Kingdom in present-day Ghana provides another glimpse. Oral accounts and some colonial records suggest that chiefs occasionally maintained relationships outside the expected norms, and the practice wasn't framed as a crisis. Instead, it was folded into the idea that leaders had access to everything: wealth, land, power, and yes, companions of their choice. If being a king meant indulging in abundance, why would companionship be the one thing limited by rigid rules? Doesn't that tell you something about how flexible human culture can be when it wants to preserve the dignity of power? Picture yourself walking through a palace compound, servants carrying baskets of cola nuts, women preparing palm wine, and guards leaning lazily on their spears. You pass by a shaded veranda and overhear two attendants joking about the chief's favorite. Their tone is light, teasing, almost affectionate. They know what's happening, but instead of scandal, it's just another quirk of power. That's how many African societies absorb these realities, by normalizing them through humor, ritual, and song. So when later colonial officials arrived, they were the ones clutching their pearls, scribbling furiously in their diaries about unnatural practices. For the communities themselves, the existence of kings, chiefs, and hidden lovers wasn't earth-shattering. It was simply part of life, carried on quietly under the watchful eyes of ancestors and the ever-listening drums of the palace. Shift your gaze now from palaces and kings to homesteads and compounds, where the real architects of daily life, women, often made decisions that bent expectations in ways few outsiders could grasp. One of the most fascinating practices across several African societies was that of the female husband. It sounds contradictory at first, doesn't it? How could a woman be called a husband? Yet in communities from the Igbo of Nigeria to the Nandi of Kenya, that was exactly the role some women took on. And it wasn't a scandal. It was an institution, carefully woven into the rules of inheritance, family, and power. Picture a wealthy Igbo woman, childless, but determined to keep her lineage alive. Instead of despairing or being sidelined, she negotiates with her kin to take another woman as her wife. She pays the bride price, just as a man would. She sets up a household, and the children her wife bears, through an agreed-upon male relative or partner, are counted as hers, legally tied to her lineage. It wasn't about hiding or pretending. It was openly recognized, inscribed into social practice, and sometimes even celebrated. The term female husband wasn't a nickname. It was a title with responsibilities, rights, and authority. Think about how radical that sounds against the backdrop of colonial expectations. Missionaries arriving later scratched their heads furiously, trying to categorize these relationships. They asked, is this woman a man now? Is this about economics or intimacy? But their confusion only shows how limited their categories were. To the local people, the system was clear. A woman could be a husband if the situation demanded it, and her authority was respected. Doesn't that tell you that gender roles in pre-colonial Africa were far more flexible than we're often taught? Now, were all female husband arrangements about love and companionship? Not always. Some were practical, tied to inheritance and family survival. But let's not pretend feelings couldn't grow in these spaces. Living under one roof, sharing responsibility, building a household, affection often takes root in places where it's not officially the point. You can probably think of modern parallels. How many marriages today start as arrangements of convenience but blossom into real companionship? Human hearts rarely follow the neat lines drawn on paper. Among the Nandi, the practice was so established that no one batted an eye when a woman married another woman to carry on her family's name. The children born into that union belonged fully to the female husband's lineage. And here's the detail that should make you pause. Those children didn't face stigma. They weren't labeled as illegitimate or strange. Society wrapped them right into the fold. Compare that with how colonial powers later insisted on rigid, narrow definitions of family, and you see the contrast starkly. The African system was pragmatic, inclusive, and quietly resistant to limiting labels. Let's bring in a historical figure. In 1929, during the famous Aba women's riots in southeastern Nigeria, women leaders, many of them wealthy, independent, and in some cases female husbands, rose to challenge colonial taxation and interference. Their authority wasn't just financial, it was social, rooted in traditions that recognized women as decision makers, heads of households, and even spouses to other women. Doesn't it flip the script when you realize that power wasn't always locked in the hands of men? Imagine strolling through a marketplace in pre-colonial West Africa. Stalls overflow with yams, palm oil, spices. Women call out prices, argue, and laugh. Somewhere, two women walk together, one slightly older, carrying herself with the confidence of a head of household. Others nod respectfully, because everyone knows she is a husband. It isn't whispered scandal. It's simply part of the rhythm of life, as normal as the bargaining going on around you. And here's a modern comparison worth thinking about. Today, debates about gender and marriage often get stuck in rigid terms. What's allowed? What's natural? But centuries ago, in African villages, people found flexible solutions to keep families strong and lineages intact. When problems arose, communities didn't always reach for punishment. They reached for adaptation. Isn't that an approach many societies today could learn from? Of course, colonial records often tried to reduce these unions to economic arrangements stripped of intimacy. It was easier for outsiders to imagine that love couldn't exist between women than to acknowledge it might. But the very fact that such institutions endured across multiple cultures suggests something deeper: the recognition that human bonds are varied, and that society works best when it leaves room for them. The female husband wasn't an anomaly. She was proof of how societies honored both necessity and the human desire for companionship. So, when you think of pre-colonial Africa, don't just picture kings on thrones and warriors on battlefields. Picture also the woman at the center of her compound, respected as a husband, raising children, managing property, and carving out a space of authority that defied simple categories. The history of female husbands isn't just about family survival. It's about the quiet acknowledgement that love, power, and identity have never been as rigid as we've been told. Imagine walking into a shrine at dusk, the air heavy with incense, drums echoing faintly outside, and the figure before you, neither quite man nor woman, clothed in flowing robes, eyes glazed as though speaking with the spirit world. You feel a shiver trace your spine, because here is someone who lives in the in-between, a place most people avoid but desperately need. In many pre-colonial African societies, shamans, mediums, and priests who blurred gender boundaries weren't mocked. They were revered, trusted as people who could hear what others couldn't. Among the Dagara of Burkina Faso, there were the gatekeepers, those rare individuals whose very essence was thought to straddle male and female energies. Without them, rituals lacked their balance, because who else could stand at the threshold between worlds? To the Dagara, these people weren't strange. They were essential, like keys in a lock you couldn't open any other way. Doesn't it make you wonder why so many modern societies treat difference as weakness, when in the past, difference was the very proof of divine selection? Travel further south, and you'd meet the Sangomas of the Zulu and Xhosa. Even today, their practices survive, with some male Sangomas wearing beads, skirts, or hairstyles considered feminine, and some women adopting male-coded dress. To outsiders, it looked unusual, but to the community, it signaled that the ancestors had claimed them. The spirits had spoken, and they had answered. Who would dare laugh at a person chosen by the ancestors to heal, to protect, to channel wisdom? Picture the scene of an initiation. The novice stands trembling, chalk smeared across their body, shells clicking softly as they move. Suddenly, their voice drops into a tone that doesn't belong to them, or rises into a register that startles the crowd. It's not performance, it's possession. The spirit has arrived. And what confirms it most isn't just the trembling or the chanting, but the sense that this person has stepped outside of simple categories, embodying both and neither, and in doing so, becoming more. The kingdom of Dahomey, known for its formidable women warriors, also left traces of priests who dressed across gender lines. European observers recorded their disapproval, calling it immoral or improper, but they also admitted, reluctantly, that these priests commanded immense influence. The people listened. The people trusted. The more the colonizers tried to sneer, the clearer it became that spiritual power wasn't bound by their imported categories. Isn't it ironic how what outsiders mocked was precisely what locals considered sacred? Let's pull in a modern comparison. Today, conversations about gender often get stuck in arguments and labels, but back then, fluidity was a sign of connection to the unseen. What's treated as controversial now was once revered. It's like the world has flipped itself inside out, forgetting that respect was once the default. Doesn't that challenge you to question how much of what we call tradition is actually just a colonial rewrite? In Uganda, the Langi people told of jock mediums, figures who often embodied both masculine and feminine qualities. These mediums weren't just tolerated, they were sought out for healing, guidance, and justice. Colonial officials eventually tried to stamp them out, declaring their practices unfit for Christian order. Yet villagers kept sneaking back, because when your child was sick or your harvest cursed, you didn't run to the magistrate. You went to the person the spirits listened to, no matter how they dressed or what roles they defied. Now, place yourself in that village, watching the medium walk by. Children might giggle at their unusual appearance, but adults hush them quickly. The medium isn't someone to mock. They're someone to respect, maybe even fear a little. Their very presence is a reminder that the world is bigger than the boxes you think in. And maybe that's why these figures lasted so long. They gave society permission to imagine more than one way of being human. So as the drums fade in your mind and the shrine doors close, you realize this: difference wasn't always stigma. In many African traditions, difference was destiny. It was the mark of the divine. Now imagine standing at the edge of a battlefield, the ground trembling beneath your feet as warriors chant, spears raised, shields rattling like thunder. You can almost smell the iron of weapons mixed with dust and sweat. In this moment of chaos and adrenaline, bonds between men were forged that went far beyond simple comradeship. War was terrifying, but it was also intimate. You depended on the man beside you not just to survive the clash, but to return with you, to eat with you, to live another day. And in many African societies, those bonds deepened into something more enduring. Relationships that the outside world, centuries later, would struggle to name. Among the Zande of Central Africa, warriors were known to take younger male partners, not just as trainees in the art of war, but also as companions. To European chroniclers, this practice seemed scandalous, but within the Zande culture, it was accepted, structured, and in some cases, even celebrated. The bonds created in the war camps weren't treated as distractions. They were understood as part of the fabric of warrior life. Doesn't it shift your perspective to realize that what colonizers dismissed as deviance was, for the people themselves, a normal extension of trust and loyalty? Picture yourself in one of those war camps. Fires crackle, meat roasts, and laughter breaks out among the men after a long day of drills. Two warriors share food from the same pot, shoulders brushing, joking in ways that feel closer than mere friendship. It's visible to everyone, yet no one interrupts. The intimacy that blooms under such conditions isn't shocking. It's predictable. After all, when you fight shoulder to shoulder and watch each other's backs in life or death moments, who else in the world could understand you better? Other societies had similar practices. In East Africa, warrior groups like the Samburu formed age-grade systems where young men spent years living together, often separated from women. In those long stretches of seclusion, bonds deepened, sometimes taking physical and emotional form. For the community, it wasn't seen as rebellion or sin. It was simply part of the rhythm of warriorhood, a phase of life acknowledged with a knowing nod. Think of it like military barracks today, where camaraderie runs so deep that soldiers speak of brothers in arms. Only here, those bonds sometimes carried an added layer of intimacy. And let's not forget the Akan of West Africa, whose proverbs occasionally hint at warrior friendships that shared more than battle. Oral tradition, always careful, rarely spelled things out directly, but the undertones are there for those who listen. Humor, satire, and song often carried the weight of truths everyone knew, but no one needed to argue about. Isn't that how secrets survive? Not in silence, but in half laughter and coded words? Think of a modern parallel: sports teams. Fans often marvel at the closeness of teammates, the way they hug after a victory, tease each other endlessly, or confess that only their teammate truly understands what it feels like to perform under such pressure. In African warrior societies, the stakes weren't trophies or medals. The stakes were survival. And that intensity turned bonds into lifelines. It's no wonder they sometimes crossed into the territory of love. Take Shaka Zulu again, a name that often comes up when talking about warrior culture. His regiments, bound together in disciplined units, delayed marriage and lived communally for years. Historians debate the implications, but the environment itself, young men sequestered, trained, and living in close quarters, was ripe for deep attachments. Whether or not Shaka himself encouraged intimacy among his regiments, the possibility alone highlights how natural such dynamics were in societies structured around age-grade cohorts and war bands. And here's where oral history plays its trick again. Instead of bluntly saying, "These men were lovers," traditions wove it into metaphors. Songs spoke of warriors whose hearts beat as one drum, of companions who would rather die together than return apart. You can almost hear the poetry in it, and you know, deep down, what it really means. Now, imagine being a villager watching these warriors return from a raid. They stride side by side, laughing, their bond radiating more than just camaraderie. Mothers sigh in relief, fathers nod in pride, and children stare with wide eyes. No one pulls them aside to question their closeness. No one demands an explanation. It's simply folded into the tapestry of community life, a reality too obvious to need discussion. So when colonial chroniclers later declared such practices unnatural, they weren't uncovering secrets. They were distorting what communities had long accepted. What outsiders labeled as scandal, locals recognized as loyalty, trust, and sometimes love. And once you realize that, the battlefield takes on a new light. It wasn't only a place of violence. It was also a place where human bonds, in all their forms, were tested and proven. Step away from the battlefield dust and into the bustle of a market. The sun beats down on stalls lined with baskets of millet, bright cloth fluttering in the breeze, and traders shouting prices over the din. Here, in these everyday spaces, same-sex relationships often found quiet cover. Unlike the loud drums of war or the pomp of palaces, the marketplace was ordinary, chaotic, and perfect for slipping under the radar. After all, when everyone is busy haggling over yams or gossiping about the price of palm oil, who really notices two people exchanging a glance that lingers a little too long? In West Africa, compounds were often sprawling family spaces where multiple generations lived together. Privacy was rare, but paradoxically, secrecy thrived. Couples who wanted discretion didn't need walls. They needed codes. A gesture here, a proverb there, a meeting arranged under the pretense of sharing chores. Think about it like modern texting. You don't always need a full paragraph. Sometimes a single emoji says everything. In the same way, communities developed quiet languages of recognition, ways of saying "I see you" without drawing attention. Among the Hausa, in what is now Nigeria, there existed roles like the Yan Daudu, men who openly adopted effeminate mannerisms and sometimes lived in relationships with other men. Before colonial authorities cracked down, these individuals were integrated into the social fabric. They worked in markets, joined in dances, and entertained at ceremonies. People joked, teased, and sometimes admired them. They weren't hidden in shadows. They were part of the hum of daily life. Doesn't that disrupt the story we're often told? That homosexuality was invisible until modern times? Imagine wandering through a compound at dusk. Women grind grain, while children chase each other through the dust. In one corner, two young men sit closer than necessary, their conversation hushed, but their laughter spilling over. Everyone notices, but no one points a finger. It's understood, maybe even teased about, but not treated as a crisis. Oral traditions often mention these quiet relationships with humor, like the proverb about two cocks sharing one coop, delivered with a knowing smile. The words sound simple, but the meaning hangs in the air for those who understand. Even in places like Ethiopia, accounts survive of monks and servants forming attachments within monasteries. The colonial writers who recorded these things often did so with judgment, but they also accidentally preserved the evidence. Behind the dry lines of their reports, unseemly friendships, improper relations. You can hear the echoes of real human connections playing out in kitchens, gardens, and market lanes. It makes you wonder, if these records survived, despite colonial disapproval, how much more must have existed, unrecorded but very much alive? Think about modern urban life. In crowded cities, people still find ways to signal interest without drawing too much attention. An eye contact on the subway, a comment in code online, a meetup disguised as just hanging out. In the same way, African communities developed their own discreet methods. Secrecy wasn't just about hiding, it was about surviving in plain sight. Doesn't it remind you that ingenuity has always been part of the human toolkit? Let's bring in another example. In Swahili coastal towns, where trade connected Africa to the wider Indian Ocean world, travelers recorded seeing relationships between men, often expressed through poetry and song. These weren't hidden underground. They circulated in social spaces, passed along like riddles or love notes disguised as metaphors about the sea and the moon. Outsiders might have missed the undertones, but locals caught them instantly. It was their code, their language, their way of keeping intimacy alive within the flow of daily life. Picture yourself in one of those towns. The call to prayer drifts through the evening air, Spices perfume the narrow alleys, and a group of young men recite verse to each other, smiling as if every line carries two meanings. The crowd claps, enjoying the performance, but you catch the glance exchange between the poet and his listener. It's there, hidden yet obvious, a story preserved in rhyme instead of ink. So while history books often spotlight kings, queens, and wars, the real heart of same-sex relationships pulsed in these everyday spaces. Markets full of noise, compounds full of eyes, streets full of watchers who knew when to look away. Love and desire found ways to thrive not just in grand ceremonies, but in the hum of ordinary life. And perhaps that's the most telling detail of all. If people found room for these relationships in the busiest, most public places, then clearly they weren't erased from the culture. They were woven into it. The silence shatters when the colonial ships arrive, their sails blotting out the horizon like storm clouds rolling in too fast. You've heard drums before, but nothing matches the sound of boots crunching over soil that isn't theirs, or the scrape of pens on paper as strangers begin cataloging your life. With the colonizers came a new set of eyes, and those eyes were sharp, judgmental, and relentless. Suddenly, the same practices that had been woven naturally into the fabric of your community, warrior bonds, female husbands, shamans with blurred genders, were rewritten in foreign ink as sins, crimes, or pathologies. European missionaries were some of the first to record what they saw, and their diaries are filled with shock. They wrote about King Mwanga, the second of Buganda, keeping male companions, about Hausa Yandaudu, dancing at festivals, about warrior friendships in Zande camps. But the tone was never neutral. Every detail was dipped in disdain, laced with words like unnatural, corrupt, and immoral. Isn't it ironic? In trying so hard to condemn, they ended up preserving the very evidence that proves these practices existed long before they arrived. You can picture the scene. A missionary sitting in his small wooden hut, sweating under the African sun, furiously scribbling in his journal, while outside the village goes on as usual. Children laugh, women barter, and somewhere, two men share a quiet moment. To the missionary, this is evidence of heathenism. To the villagers, it's Tuesday. The disconnect is almost comical, if it weren't for the fact that those writings would later become weapons. Colonial administrations didn't just stop at recording. They legislated, imported legal codes, criminalized same-sex relationships where none had been criminal before. The British brought sodomy laws to their colonies, laws that still linger on the books of many African nations today. What had once been normalized, ritualized, or even celebrated was suddenly pushed underground. Can you feel the weight of that shift? From openness to secrecy, from recognition to denial, all because of foreign moral frameworks imposed at gunpoint and crosspoint. Take Nigeria as an example. Before colonial rule, the institution of the female husband was widely accepted among Igbo and other groups. After colonial officials encountered it, they dismissed it as economic trickery or outright perversion. The nuance, the cultural logic, the lived realities, they were swept aside. Instead, reports were filed, laws were drafted, and punishments enforced. A practice that once kept families stable and lineages intact was suddenly illegal. Isn't that the very definition of erasure? When survival strategies honed over centuries are struck down by a line in someone else's law book? And then there was the church. Missionaries didn't just preach sermons. They built schools, hospitals, and courts of morality. Students were drilled with new definitions of family, new rules of propriety. Spiritual mediums who embodied both genders were labeled witches or possessed, and many were violently suppressed. Songs and proverbs carrying same-sex undertones were mocked, discouraged, or left out of official transcriptions. What survived had to be coded even deeper, tucked into laughter and satire, because now the watchful eye of the colonial priest hovered over everything. Think of a modern analogy. Imagine a foreign company buying out your hometown and rewriting all the laws overnight. Suddenly, the jokes you tell, the families you recognize, even the friendships you form are deemed illegal. Overnight, the safe becomes dangerous. That's what colonization did to sexual and gender diversity in Africa. It recast it through foreign definitions and punished what had once been normal. But here's the twist. Even under colonial pressure, people found ways to resist. Marketplaces still buzzed with the presence of Yan Daudu. Stories of Mwanga too still circulated, though now tinged with tragedy. Mediums still whispered prophecies, though they had to be more cautious. The presence of colonial eyes didn't erase the practices. It only forced them into disguise. Doesn't that prove how resilient human identity really is? So as you watch the colonial ships vanish from the horizon in your mind, leaving behind schools, churches, and courtrooms, remember this. They didn't invent morality, but they exported their own and enforced it at the expense of what was already there. And the cost was enormous, not just in laws and punishments, but in the silencing of voices that had once sung freely under the baobab tree. Step back into the village square after the storm of colonial intrusion and notice how people respond. They don't throw their traditions into the fire. They bend them, twist them, and sometimes hide them in plain sight. Humor becomes armor, ritual becomes camouflage, and the community finds ways to push back without swinging a spear. You can almost hear the laughter at a festival when someone cracks a joke about two men sharing a mat too often. The crowd roaring not with outrage, but with recognition. Satire worked like a shield, allowing people to say what couldn't be said directly. Isn't it clever how laughter, so easily dismissed as frivolous, becomes a tool of survival? Take the Yoruba Gelede masquerades in present-day Nigeria and Benin. These performances often poked fun at social roles, exaggerating men as women and women as men, exposing the fluidity everyone already knew existed. To an outsider, it might look like comedy. To insiders, it was coded commentary, a ritual reminder that society was never as rigid as colonial officials insisted. Masks and costumes gave permission to invert norms for a night, to laugh at authority, and to keep alive the truths that no law could kill. Rituals also became quiet acts of defiance. Among the Dagara, gatekeepers, those spiritual figures embodying both male and female traits, continued to be honored even when missionaries sneered. Their roles were too essential to abandon. You can picture a ceremony deep in the countryside, flames flickering, chants rising, as a gatekeeper steps forward, painted in white clay. Whatever colonial laws said, the village knew the ancestors demanded balance, and that balance could only come through those who embodied the in-between. Laws on paper meant little when spirits demanded otherwise. And then there's the marketplace, still buzzing. Remember the Yan Daudu of Hausa culture? Even as colonial laws branded them as criminals, they remained visible, singing, dancing, and entertaining at weddings. Their performances weren't just entertainment. They were living satire. By exaggerating femininity, by daring to exist so openly, They mocked the colonial obsession with rigid categories. Isn't it striking that the very people targeted for erasure became the loudest reminders that identity couldn't be boxed in? Think about modern stand-up comedians who use humor to challenge politics. They turn ridicule into resistance, making audiences laugh while exposing injustice. Pre-colonial and colonial-era African societies did something similar. Through song, dance, and ritual, they kept alive what couldn't be spoken outright. Every laugh, every drumbeat, every masquerade was a refusal to let identity be erased. A famous example comes from Mwanga, the second story in Uganda. After his execution by colonial authorities, songs about his defiance, both political and personal, circulated quietly. They were disguised as laments or as jokes, but everyone knew what they really meant. Memory survived not through textbooks, but through whispered lyrics, passed from one generation to the next. Picture villagers gathered in secret, someone humming a tune, others nodding knowingly. The colonial officer might hear only a song. The people heard resistance, and resistance wasn't always solemn. Sometimes it was joy itself, dancing harder, laughing louder, embracing difference even when condemned. Isn't there something powerful about the refusal to be sad in the face of suppression? That's why humor, ritual, and satire mattered. They turned survival into an art form, a performance everyone was in on except the oppressors. Imagine yourself at one of these festivals. The drums pound, masks swirl, the crowd howls with laughter as men play women and women mimic men. The colonial officer in the corner shifts uncomfortably, not sure whether to laugh or scold. But for the community, it's crystal clear. This is more than a show. It's memory disguised as mockery, tradition dressed in performance, truth hidden in plain sight. So even in the darkest chapters, when laws tried to silence, the people found ways to keep singing. They laughed, they masked, they chanted, and they carried their history forward, not on paper, but in rhythm and ritual. And isn't that the most human response of all? To laugh when someone tries to erase you, and in laughing, to outlast them. Fast forward in your mind to a crowded city street in present-day Africa. Neon signs flicker, motorbikes weave through traffic, and young people scroll on their phones while waiting at food stalls. Somewhere in that chaos, you hear a chant from a protest. A rainbow flag flashes briefly in the crowd, and you realize this moment isn't detached from the past. It's an echo. The same songs, codes, and rituals that kept same-sex love alive in pre-colonial times are still rippling through modern struggles. When activists in Nigeria challenge the Same-Sex Marriage Prohibition Act, they're not importing foreign values. They're reclaiming suppressed traditions. Female husbands among the Igbo, Yandaudu in Hausa culture, Sunday warrior bonds. These are historical precedents, proving that African societies had space for sexual and gender diversity long before colonial laws rewrote the rules. Isn't it striking that what is now labeled un-African is in fact deeply African? The real foreign import wasn't homosexuality. It was homophobia, carried in Bibles and law books by colonizers. Take South Africa, often seen as an exception today because it legalized same-sex marriage in 2006. That legal breakthrough didn't come from nowhere. It drew strength from centuries of local traditions where fluidity existed in spiritual and social roles. Sangomas, who crossed gender boundaries, communities that honored difference as divine. All of that cultural memory provided a foundation activists could point to. The modern Constitution echoed what villages once knew instinctively, that diversity strengthens, not weakens, a people. Picture a rally in Nairobi where activists chant, "We are here. We have always been here." The phrasing isn't accidental. It's a direct challenge to the narrative that homosexuality is a new Western intrusion. Oral traditions whisper back in agreement. Proverbs about unusual bonds, songs about warrior companionship, the legacy of female husbands, all stand behind those activists like ancestral witnesses. Doesn't that give you goosebumps? Imagining protesters marching not alone, but in the company of centuries of history? Consider the story of Simon Nicoli, the South African activist who fought apartheid while also openly gay. He often said he couldn't separate his identities. Freedom had to be full, or it wasn't freedom at all. In a way, his struggle mirrored pre-colonial figures who embodied more than one role, spiritual mediums who crossed gender lines, warriors whose loyalties were both martial and personal. The continuity is uncanny, like history replaying itself with new faces. Now think about everyday life. A young queer African today might scroll through social media, finding coded hashtags and inside jokes that help them feel seen. Isn't that just a digital version of the old proverbs, songs and gestures that once served the same purpose? The platforms have changed, from marketplaces to Twitter threads, but the survival tactic is identical. Code your truth so those who understand will understand, and those who don't can walk on by without noticing. In Senegal, for example, griots still perform songs that carry layered meanings. While the official verse praises families or leaders, subtle undertones nod toward relationships that don't fit conventional molds. Audiences smile, some laugh knowingly, and the performance carries on. It's the same double voicing strategy that kept traditions alive under colonialism, now continuing in modern forms. Resistance doesn't always wear a placard. Sometimes it hides in a joke, a lyric, or a look. But the struggle isn't only cultural, it's legal and political. In many countries, colonial-era laws remain, weaponized by modern governments to silence LGBTQ+ communities. Activists often face arrest, harassment, or worse. And yet, like their ancestors, they adapt. Underground support networks mirror the hidden companionships of compounds. Digital safe spaces echo the secrecy of coded proverbs, and pride parades, where possible, revive the carnival spirit of masquerades that once mocked rigid roles. Doesn't it make you realize that history never fully disappears? It just changes costumes. So as you stand in that modern city street in your imagination, hearing chants echo off concrete instead of drums, you can trace the line backward. From activists with placards to warriors with spears, from hashtags to riddles, from rainbow flags to masquerade masks. The struggle for recognition is ancient. The survival strategy's timeless. The past isn't gone. It's marching right alongside the present. The loudest sound you can hear isn't a drum or a chant. It's the echo of memory refusing to die. Imagine sitting again under that wide baobab tree, the same place where we began. Only now, you carry centuries of stories on your back. The whispered songs, the hidden glances, the rituals that defied erasure. Every time someone says, homosexuality is un-African, those echoes thunder louder, reminding you that the real un-African act was the silencing imposed by colonial rule. Think of the oral traditions we traced. Hunters choosing each other, chiefs with hidden lovers, women becoming husbands, shamans embodying both genders, warriors forging bonds in fire. These weren't accidents. They were part of the living tapestry of African societies. Colonizers didn't erase them completely. They only tried to. The proof lingers in proverbs, in folk tales, in the awkward missionary journals that complained too much and revealed too much. Doesn't it strike you as almost poetic that the same voices that tried to condemn ended up preserving the evidence? And now, centuries later, reclaiming that history matters more than ever. It matters because it restores truth where lies have settled too comfortably. It matters because young Africans growing up today deserve to know that their identities aren't foreign intrusions, but rooted in deep ancestral soil. Imagine being told all your life that who you are is imported, only to discover that your ancestors sang your story by firelight. Wouldn't that change the way you walk in the world? Take Binyavanga Wainaina, the Kenyan writer who came out publicly before his passing in 2019. His declaration wasn't just personal. It was a historical reclamation. By speaking openly, he connected himself not just to modern activism, but to the line of ancestors who lived these truths long before they were criminalized. That's the power of memory. It doesn't just remind, it reawakens. Picture yourself strolling through a modern African city where skyscrapers rise above old colonial buildings. Beneath the concrete, beneath the glass, lie layers of memory like sediment. The chants of warriors, the laughter of masquerades, the whispers of lovers, all still there if you know how to listen. Every act of remembering is an act of resistance. Every story retold pulls the thread tighter, weaving past and present into a fabric no law can shred. And here's the bigger question. What happens if we forget? What happens if the stories aren't told? If the coded songs fade? If the proverbs lose their double meanings? Forgetting doesn't just silence the past. It distorts the present, leaving people believing lies about themselves. Memory is protection against that. It's why scholars, activists, griots, and ordinary storytellers keep digging, retelling, preserving. Doesn't it feel like the ancestors are nudging us, saying, don't let them rewrite who we were? Think of it like a relay race. The griots carried the torch through oral tradition, even when colonial winds tried to blow it out. Activists carry it today, marching in streets, writing books, raising flags. And you, simply by listening to this history, are part of that chain. You don't need to wear beads or chant at a shrine to honor it. Remembering is enough. Sharing is enough. When laughing at the old proverbs with new understanding is enough. So as you settle back under that imaginary baobab, let the echoes surround you. The hunter's bond, the chief's glances, the wives who are husbands, the mediums at the shrine, the warriors in camp, the dancers in markets, the satirists in masks, the activists with placards, all form a chorus saying the same thing. We were here, we are here, and we will not be forgotten. That's the untold history of homosexuality in pre-colonial Africa. It isn't gone. It's alive, carried in memory, waiting for you to hear it and keep it safe. And as you let those echoes of hidden love, whispered songs, and ancestral resilience fade into the night air, your mind drifts from the intimacy of untold histories to the broader canvas of ordinary existence. Because beyond kings, warriors, and coded proverbs, life in pre-colonial Africa unfolded in rhythms both familiar and surprising. fields tilled at sunrise, laughter echoing through compounds, marketplaces bursting with color and sound. To truly understand the context where those stories of identity and affection took root, you need to walk through the daily routines of a village where survival, joy, and community intertwined under the African sun. The rooster does not politely suggest that you wake up. It screams as if it has been planning this ambush all night. You roll over on your mat, the woven reeds pressing into your back, and try to pretend for just a moment longer that dawn hasn't arrived. But then the smell of smoke from last night's fire creeps in, stinging your nose, and the faint glow of the rising sun slants through the cracks in your mud and thatch hut. Sleep is over whether you like it or not. Out in the compound, you hear someone coughing, another person laughing, and a goat bleating as if it too is annoyed at the hour. The village is stirring, and you are now part of its rhythm, like it or not. You rub your eyes and shuffle outside. The air is crisp, cooler than it will be later when the sun climbs high enough to make you curse the very idea of movement. The ground is damp with dew, and your bare feet sink into the earth with a satisfying squish. You look around, and the scene feels oddly familiar, like the opening credits of a historical documentary that forgot to provide subtitles. Women adjust their wrappers and balance babies on their hips. Men stretch their arms, and children already scamper after chickens that clearly want no part of their games. The symphony of sound, laughter, coughing, animal noises, and the rustle of leaves becomes your alarm clock. The first order of business is light, not the soft glow of a bedside lamp, but the stubborn flicker of fire coaxed from last night's embers. You crouch by the hearth, blowing gently on the ash-covered coals. Sparks fly like impatient fireflies until, at last, the wood catches and smoke billows up into your face. You cough, eyes watering, while muttering something that could pass for a prayer or a complaint. Imagine starting every single day this way. Your hair and clothes permanently infused with the scent of smoke. If perfume ads existed here, they would read, Eau de Comfy. As the fire takes, the smells of the morning begin to shift. Someone nearby is roasting cassava, the earthy aroma curling into the air, while another household stirs a pot of millet porridge. You're not eating yet, though. Your job is just to keep the fire alive, a task as humble as it is vital. This is the slow heartbeat of the village, measured not in seconds, but in chores. No coffee machines, no alarms on your phone, just you, the fire, and a rooster. Yet even in these quiet, smoky minutes, life is not without humor. A child wanders past with hair sticking up in every direction, carrying a calabash almost bigger than their head, and trips over a goat that seems personally offended. The child wails, the goat bleats in indignation, and the whole scene could win first prize on a reality show called Pre-Colonial Bloopers. Don't laugh too loudly, though. You'll be tripping soon enough when your turn comes to fetch water. History often paints these mornings as purely solemn and hard-working, but the truth is far more colorful. Villages weren't silent places where everyone moved like stone statues. They were alive, noisy, and messy, like every neighborhood you know today. Think about your own mornings. The traffic honking outside, someone yelling at their dog, maybe your neighbor, blasting music you never asked for. Replace the cars with chickens, the speakers with drums, and the dog with a goat that thinks it owns the street, and you're not far off. The sun creeps higher, its rays slipping across the compound, painting everything gold for a fleeting moment before the day becomes hot and relentless. People stretch, adjust their wraps, and prepare themselves for the cascade of tasks that will fill the hours. For now, though, you're still suspended in that sleepy moment between night and day, where the sounds of life are as gentle as they will ever be. And just as the smoke begins to sting your eyes again, you remember that the fire is not the only thing demanding attention. The water pots are empty. You hoist the clay pot onto your head and wobble for a second, feeling as though gravity itself has picked today to mock you. The pot is empty for now, but even emptiness has weight when it's balanced precariously on top of your skull. Around you, other villagers are preparing for the same trek, adjusting their wraps, tightening the ropes of their gourds, and exchanging groggy words that sound halfway between gossip and complaints. A group begins to move toward the narrow footpath that leads to the stream, and you fall in step, the rhythm of bare feet slapping against packed earth marking the start of another ritual. The path winds past tall grass that scratches at your arms, trees that creak as though sharing secrets, and the occasional termite mound that rises like a natural skyscraper. Birds dart overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a monkey screeches indignantly, as if offended that humans insist on interrupting its morning. The air is cooler under the trees, filled with the smell of damp soil and leaves. You walk carefully, aware that the path can turn treacherous. Roots jutting out like traps, rocks that seem to roll under your feet at the worst possible moment. If you've ever carried a too-full coffee cup across an office without spilling it, multiply that tension by 100. That's what balancing a clay pot here feels like. The chatter begins to build as the group settles into rhythm. Someone tells a joke that makes half the group laugh and the other half groan. Another person leans closer to share a tidbit of gossip, their voice dropping conspiratorially. You catch fragments. Who visited whose hut? Whose goats wandered into whose fields? Who might be planning a marriage alliance? Information flows here as freely as the water you're about to fetch. In many ways, this trip is less about the water and more about the connections. Moments to laugh, to share, to gripe, and to affirm that life is happening in 100 little details. The stream finally comes into view, its surface glinting with the early sunlight, a ribbon of silver weaving through green. Children squeal with delight as they splash near the shallows, their giggles echoing across the water. Women crouch near the banks, their hands moving with practiced ease as they dip pots, let the bubbles escape, then lift the vessels carefully, water sloshing dangerously close to the rim. You crouch down and do the same, trying not to think about the fact that the very same stream also serves as a drinking spot for animals further upstream. No filters, no bottled brands, just trust in your boiling fire back home. As you rise, with the now heavy pot balanced once more on your head, the true test begins. The return journey. The pot hums with weight, water shifting inside like a restless passenger. Every wobble sends ripples across your body, forcing you to straighten your spine and steady your steps. You find yourself moving in sync with the others, their balance keeping yours in check, like a parade of unsung acrobats who never trained in a circus. Want a modern comparison? It's like carrying your groceries from the car in one trip, refusing to go back for a second load, and praying the flimsy plastic handles don't snap. The difference here is that instead of bags, you have gallons of water perched above your neck, and the stakes are a little higher than spilled milk. The group presses forward, talking less now as the strain sets in. Sweat beads on your forehead, the sun no longer gentle, but insistent. The path seems longer on the way back, each rise and dip a fresh insult to your shoulders and legs. You grit your teeth and keep moving because stopping isn't an option. When you finally step back into the village, the relief is almost euphoric. Pots are lowered, backs are stretched, and chatter picks up again, filled with relief and satisfaction. In that moment, you realize that water here isn't just about thirst. It's about survival, about community, and about patience learned one careful step at a time. And just when you think you've mastered patience, you remember another daily demand that waits at home, gathering the firewood. The water pot is safely back in its corner, cool against the shade of the hut wall. And now, another task whispers your name. Firewood. Because without fuel, all that precious water won't become porridge, tea, or soup. It will just sit there, judging you. So, you pick up a rope, adjust it across your shoulders, and head toward the thicket with a few others who look about as thrilled as you feel. Collecting firewood is like a group project in school. No one truly enjoys it, but it must get done, or the whole team suffers. The path this time winds away from the stream, deeper into bushland where shrubs give way to taller trees, and fallen branches become treasure. You bend down, testing each stick. Too thin, it snaps uselessly. Too thick, it's not worth dragging home unless you secretly moonlight as a lumberjack. Eventually, you build a pile of the right size, long enough to burn steadily, light enough to carry, without regretting every decision in your life. You bundle it together with rope and hoist it up, the wood pressing into your back with an intimacy you never asked for. Here's the thing. People often imagine pre-colonial villages as places of constant struggle, but there's humor here too, even in the middle of labor. Someone jokes about your awkward bundle looking like a nest for a family of snakes, and everyone laughs at your expense. Another person begins humming a tune, and soon it becomes a chorus, voices bouncing through the trees as though the forest itself is amused. Have you ever noticed how shared misery becomes lighter when wrapped in music? That principle hasn't changed in centuries. Once back at the compound, you drop the bundle with a grunt of relief. The fire is coaxed to life again, this time with proper fuel, and smoke coils upward in stubborn defiance. You crouch close, feeding small twigs first, then thicker branches until the flames leap confidently. Smoke, however, has no manners. It clings to your hair, your clothes, your very skin, until you smell like a walking barbecue. And you know what? That smell never leaves. Anthropologists today sometimes laugh when they note that old cloths dug up in village sites still carry the faintest traces of smoke, as if history itself held on to the scent. Breakfast begins to take shape over the fire. Pots simmer, lids rattle, and the air thickens with the smell of roasting cassava and boiling millet. Your stomach growls like a restless drum. But food here isn't just about filling bellies. It's about rituals and roles. The hearth is a woman's domain, the beating center of family life, where knowledge passes through recipes and love disguises itself in the form of well-stirred porridge. It's also a place of teaching. Children are scolded for dropping embers or praised for fetching water just right. Fire is both danger and comfort, teacher and companion. Modern kitchens have their own version of this chaos. Think of the smoke detector that insists on shrieking the moment you so much as look at a frying pan. Think of the argument over who forgot to stir the pot or who burned the rice. The details are different, but the story is the same. Cooking always demands patience, and patience always demands laughter. As the fire crackles and pots bubble, the smell grows richer, heavier, impossible to ignore. You glance around at the circle of people waiting, chatting, stretching sore backs, all united by hunger and anticipation. Soon, spoons will clink against calabashes, and laughter will rise with the steam. But before that first bite comes, there is still the ritual of gathering together for the morning meal. The first spoonful of the day is never just food. It's a declaration that you've survived another morning. Imagine the smell of hot millet porridge rising from clay pots, steam curling into the air like incense, and your empty stomach roaring louder than the village drum. This is your hook into the day, chosen not by chance, but by necessity. If you thought modern people worship coffee, wait until you see the way everyone here eyes that bubbling porridge. You settle onto a low stool, the ground cool beneath your feet, and a calabash bowl is passed into your hands. The porridge is thick, creamy, with a faint sour tang if it's been fermented overnight. A spoonful sticks to your tongue, filling your mouth with warmth that spreads down to your belly. It isn't fancy. No cinnamon sprinkle, no latte art. But it's comfort you can taste, the fuel that will send men to the fields and women to their weaving, the fuel that will keep children chasing goats until dusk. The meal is more than eating, it's social glue. Families gather, trading stories as easily as bites. Someone jokes about the rooster's early performance this morning. Another teases about who nearly spilled their pot at the stream, and laughter ripples through the group. You may not realize it, but this chatter is a form of insurance. By eating together, you weave bonds that make work bearable later in the day. Anthropologists studying village life often note how these communal meals served as miniature councils, places where decisions were hinted at and gossip was measured. Think of it as the original breakfast meeting, minus the PowerPoint slides, of course. Even children, often fidgety, are drawn into the rhythm of eating. One child drops a spoonful, and the dog lurking nearby snatches it up before anyone can blink. Everyone bursts out laughing, and the child looks both embarrassed and secretly pleased to have provided entertainment. That moment of laughter eases tension and prepares everyone for what comes next. Hours of labor under an unforgiving sun. Sometimes the porridge is sweetened with honey, sometimes flavored with ground nuts, sometimes plain. It depends on the season, the harvest, and the family's fortunes. Compare it with your modern breakfast. Cereal from a box, toast popped from a machine, and you start to wonder, which one really feels more alive? Here, each bite tells you about the rains, the soil, the herd's health. Food isn't just calories. It's a daily report card from the earth itself. And then there are those who hover nearby, watching for leftovers. Dogs, chickens, and even the occasional goat know exactly when breakfast is served. A quick tilt of a bowl, a clumsy child's hand, and they're in. Animals here are part of the rhythm too, sharing in the scraps, keeping the cycle tight. As the bowls empty, spoons scrape against calabashes, signaling the end of the feast. Bellies are satisfied, laughter lingers, and the village is ready for the real work to begin. Men stretch their arms, women adjust their wrappers, and children chase after the last drops of fun before duty calls. And just like that, the chatter around the hearth dissolves into the shuffle of feet toward fields and cattle pens. You follow the men as they leave the compound, tools slung over shoulders, calves already flexing in protest at the long walk ahead. The rhythm of the day shifts. Breakfast has ended, and now the land and the cattle call with voices that are impossible to ignore. Each man knows his path, whether it leads to furrowed fields or open pastures. You step onto the dusty track, feeling the ground warm beneath your feet, the sun climbing steadily, like it has an agenda to make you sweat as quickly as possible. The fields stretch out in patches of green and brown, an irregular quilt stitched together by generations of hands. Some areas are lush, thick with millet and sorghum swaying in the breeze, while others look stubborn, dry, as if daring you to coax life from their soil. Tools come down from shoulders, hoes, sickles, and the occasional spear leaning nearby for insurance against both wild animals and rival herdsmen. You bend low, metal striking soil with a dull rhythm, thud after thud, until the sound becomes its own music. Farming here is not solitary. It is a chorus of grunts, laughter, and shouted instructions, blending into the call of birds and the snorting of cattle tethered close by. If you've ever spent a Saturday mowing a suburban lawn and felt proud of your work, imagine that. Only instead of 30 minutes, it's the entire day. And instead of neat rectangles of grass, it's stubborn soil that demands not only sweat, but cleverness. Timing matters. Plant too early, and the rains betray you. Too late, and the harvest punishes you. That razor's edge between hunger and plenty sits right beneath your feet with every swing of the hoe. Cattle herding has its own rhythm. Boys barely taller than the cows themselves whistle and shout, guiding the animals toward greener spots. The cattle snort, stomp, and occasionally test their luck by wandering off, forcing someone to sprint after them, arms flailing, dignity abandoned. These herds aren't just food on hooves, they're wealth, dowries, and status, each animal a moving bank account. No wonder eyes stay sharp, counting every head, ensuring none vanish into the bush or the hands of thieves. In the midst of this, jokes still fly. Someone teases you about your weak hoe swing, another about nearly tripping over a cow's tail. Work is hard, but laughter keeps it from breaking you. There's even singing, improvised tunes that turn sweat into rhythm, transforming exhaustion into something almost bearable. Anthropologists who later studied these patterns often noted how labor songs served both to coordinate effort and to remind people that no one suffered alone. By midday, the sun is ruthless. Sweat drips down your back, your arms ache, and the soil looks less like an ally and more like an adversary. You pause, leaning on your hoe, gazing across the land where the horizon shimmers with heat. And yet, this is life. Steady, cyclical, demanding, and oddly satisfying. Work here binds you to the earth and to each other, just as surely as breakfast bound you to your family. As the fields hum with effort and the cattle chew in slow defiance of the sun, another part of the village beats with a different rhythm. The craftspeople shaping the objects that make all this possible. While the fields echo with the thud of hoes and the low grumble of cattle, the village center hums with a different kind of energy. One shaped not by sweat dripping onto soil, but by skill flowing through hands. You wander toward the shaded huts where craftwork rules the day, and the first sound you catch is the rhythmic scrape of a knife against wood. It's almost hypnotic, like a drummer tapping quietly before the full band begins. Here, daily life reveals another truth. Survival is not just about planting. It's about making, fixing, shaping. You pause at the side of a basket, slowly taking form, under the fingers of a weaver. Thin strips of palm fiber crisscross in a deliberate pattern, each movement small, but the outcome monumental. These baskets will carry food from the fields, transport goods to the market, and even serve as makeshift cradles. The weaver doesn't rush. Time stretches differently here, measured in rows completed rather than minutes ticking by. Watching is oddly satisfying, like scrolling through endless DIY videos online, except here the stakes are higher. You actually need the finished product to eat tonight. Not far away, the smell of iron tickles your nose. You follow it to the blacksmith's hut, where sparks leap with every strike of the hammer. The smith is bare-chested, sweat glistening, his arms moving with the casual power of someone who knows metal bends only if you command it properly. A hoe head is reshaped, a knife sharpened, and suddenly the tools you saw in the fields this morning make sense. Without this man's fire and patience, planting would be misery, and hunting would be impossible. If farmers are the lifeblood of the village, blacksmiths are its bones. Carvers sit nearby, chiseling stools and masks from logs. The stools are simple but sturdy, the kind you'll see under every adult at gatherings. The masks, though, carry a different weight. They aren't just decorations. They're doorways to ritual, to spirit, to the unseen. Each groove holds meaning, each stroke a whisper of ancestry. You trace the lines with your eyes and wonder, how many generations have sat on stools shaped this way? How many ceremonies have begun with masks like these? And then, of course, there are the potters. Women squat by clay mounds, their hands slick with earth, shaping pots that will carry water, cook meals, and store grain. The clay glistens in the sunlight, turning slowly under practiced palms until it resembles the very vessels you carried to the stream earlier. Later, these pots will be fired, hardened, and used for years, their surfaces darkened by smoke and time. If you've ever dropped a store-bought plate and sighed at the inconvenience, imagine dropping one of these and realizing it's weeks of labor reduced to shards. You'd cry too. Modern life often celebrates convenience, but here, craftsmanship defines dignity. Every object tells you about the patience of hands, the knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, father to son, master to apprentice. In fact, some famous African leaders were proud of their roots in craftsmanship. Take Shaka Zulu, for instance. Before he was known as a warrior king, he grew up in a community where the making of spears, shields, and tools was not just skill, but survival. The artistry of craft formed the foundation of power itself. As the day unfolds, the hum of weaving, carving, hammering, and shaping joins the chorus of hoes in the fields and bells on cattle necks. Together, they create a soundtrack to village life that is both ordinary and extraordinary. And just as you admire the final twist of a basket handle or the gleam of a polished knife, you hear the distant call of another world entirely, the marketplace, where all these labors collide in trade and talk. The marketplace does not politely announce itself. It crashes into your senses like a marching band you didn't know you joined. Imagine walking into a clearing where color, sound, and smell all compete for your attention, none of them willing to step aside. This is the hook that grips you, the place where every path in the village eventually leads. Fields may feed you, fire may warm you, but the market? The market connects you to everything and everyone beyond your hut. Stalls aren't neat rows with tidy price tags. They're mats spread on the ground, baskets tipped open, gourds gleaming in the sun. You wander past heaps of red peppers that dare your nose to twitch, piles of smoked fish that smell both tempting and suspicious, and pyramids of millet grain that look as carefully arranged as any modern supermarket display. Except here, the guarantee of freshness is your own nose, and the price is whatever you can haggle down with a smile, a laugh, or sheer persistence. Salt glitters in small piles, carried from distant mines. Beads in brilliant colors catch the light, promising both beauty and status to whoever wears them. There are even iron tools on offer, knives and hoes forged by blacksmiths whose reputations stretch beyond the village itself. Every item here tells a story of origin: salt from the desert's edge, cloth woven on a neighbor's loom, a gourd traded from a cousin's cousin several villages away. The market is less about objects and more about movement. Goods flowing, stories spreading, connections growing. And then there's the sound. Voices rise and fall, haggling with the precision of seasoned negotiators. One seller insists her yams are worth double because of how large they are, while a buyer shakes his head, muttering about last week's bargain. Children weave between stalls, giggling, their eyes locked on sweets made of honey and ground nuts. Drums beat in the background, not as a performance, but as part of the rhythm of life. If you've ever wandered through a Saturday flea market and heard someone hawk 2 for 1, last price, you already understand the vibe. Of course, gossip thrives here better than anywhere else. The market is the unofficial newsroom, where stories are traded faster than salt. Who is courting whom? Whose goat strayed into whose garden? Who is secretly planning to move closer to a new water source? These tidbits pass from ear to ear with the same urgency as grain. Sometimes they carry warnings, other times entertainment, and often a blend of both. If you want to know what's really happening in the village, forget the chief. Listen to the chatter by the pepper pile. The market also welcomes strangers. Traders arrive from nearby villages, sometimes from far-off lands, bringing goods you've never seen before. Imagine holding a bead of glass that sparkles differently from the local ones, or tasting cola nuts that sharpen your tongue like caffeine does today. These small shocks remind you that your world is part of a much larger web, one that stretches across rivers, forests, and deserts. You pause by a stall selling woven mats, the patterns intricate, the colors dazzling. The woman behind the stall winks, insisting the mat would make your hut the envy of your neighbors. You laugh, but part of you believes her. Isn't that the same logic behind buying the latest phone or sneakers today? Some desires never change. They just swap materials. The sun beats down, shadows shrinking as the crowd thickens. The air grows heavy with spice, smoke, and sweat. But no one seems in a hurry to leave. The market is more than a place to buy and sell. It's a theater of life where every trade, every glance, every word matters. And while adults navigate bargains and news, children carve out their own world of play, their games spilling into the corners of the bustling square. Children never need a formal invitation to turn ordinary chaos into play. While the marketplace hums with the business of salt, beads, and gossip, they dart between stalls like mischievous spirits, laughing as though their lungs are made of drums. A half-empty gourd becomes a ball. A stick transforms into a spear. And suddenly, The dusty corner of the square is an arena for warriors, hunters, and kings. Their shrieks and laughter mix with the bargaining voices of adults. Two soundtracks playing at once, both equally essential to the village's rhythm. You watch as a group of children organize themselves into a chase. The rules whispered quickly and forgotten just as quickly. A goat, poor soul, becomes the accidental referee when one child bumps into it, sending it bleeding in outrage. Everyone collapses in laughter, even the adults nearby, because no game in this village is complete without at least one animal deciding it's had enough of human foolishness. Does this scene remind you of a modern playground, where kids invent rules faster than parents can follow them? The difference here is that the ground is dust instead of asphalt, and the toys are whatever your imagination can wrestle from sticks, stones, and stray gourds. Not all children play, of course. Some stand at the edge of the market, tethered to smaller duties, herding younger siblings, carrying small bundles for mothers, or keeping an eye on the family's chickens. Responsibility here arrives early, woven into games rather than replacing them. A boy might herd goats in the morning and then use those very goats as props in his afternoon games. A girl might carry her baby brother on her back, swaying gently, while still giggling at jokes her friends whisper. Duty and play blur together, one feeding the other, teaching balance long before adulthood demands it. Older children sometimes rehearse the roles they'll soon inherit. Boys mimic the cattle herders, whistling and shouting commands that the cows pointedly ignore. Girls kneel by imaginary fires, stirring pretend pots with sticks, scolding invisible younger siblings who dare to misbehave. You could call it make-believe, but here it's training, an apprenticeship disguised as fun. By the time they're old enough to take on the real tasks, their bodies already know the rhythm. There's also music, because no gathering of children is complete without rhythm. Hands slap thighs, sticks strike the ground, and voices chant improvised verses. Some lines are nonsense, others sharp with wit, but all pulse with energy. It's playful now, but these very rhythms will one day carry weight at ceremonies, rituals, and dances. Childhood here is not a pause before real life. It's life itself, bubbling with lessons hidden under laughter. Sometimes a traveler or elder pauses to watch the children and smile knowingly. They remember their own games decades earlier. Different players, same rules, same dust, same laughter. In that recognition lies continuity, the unbroken thread of community stretching back generations. Imagine someone today recalling their childhood hopscotch while watching kids with smartphones invent their own games. The tools shift, the giggles remain eternal. As the afternoon sun grows heavier, shadows stretch long, and energy wanes. Children are called back by their mothers' voices, tugged from play into chores. Yet even as they gather goats, fetch water, or stir pots, the sparkle of games lingers in their eyes. And as the dust of play settles, another layer of village life stirs awake. The quiet hum of shrines, rituals, and the invisible world that walks alongside the living. The games fade into silence, replaced by a sound altogether different, the low thrum of a drum that isn't meant for dancing, at least not the kind that happens in the marketplace. This rhythm carries weight, an invitation not just for the ears, but for the soul. You turn toward a corner of the village where shrines sit beneath trees, their bases marked by offerings of kola nuts, calabashes of palm wine, and feathers that quiver lightly in the breeze. Here, daily life shifts from chatter and chores to the unseen, the invisible thread that ties the living to their ancestors and the spirits they believe walk among them. You kneel beside others at the shrine, the air heavy with the smell of earth and ash. A priest or elder speaks in a tone both soothing and commanding, reciting prayers that flow like water. The words aren't just requests. They are reminders, affirmations that the living acknowledge they stand on the shoulders of the dead. The ancestors are not gone. They are present, woven into soil, wind, and memory. When you pour a few drops of palm wine onto the ground before drinking, you aren't wasting it. You're offering the first taste to those who came before. Think of it as history's version of respect the Wi-Fi password sharer. You honor those who gave you access to the network of life. The drums quicken, voices rise, and soon you're swept into the rhythm. Some villagers sway, others clap, and a few enter trance-like states, their bodies moving as though strings are being pulled by unseen hands. To outside eyes, it might look strange, even unsettling, but here it makes perfect sense. When the spirit world speaks, the body listens. Rituals like this aren't weekend hobbies. They are woven into survival itself. Whether you pray for rain, protection from illness, or peace after a dispute, the ancestors are the court of final appeal. Symbols matter too. Masks, carved earlier by skilled hands, emerge now. No longer mere wood, but vessels of power. They cover faces, transform voices, and remind everyone that the line between human and spirit is thinner than dust. Fires crackle, smoke rises, and you feel goosebumps prick your skin though the air is warm. It's the uncanny sense that you are not alone, that eyes far older than yours are watching. Modern life has its echoes of this. Have you ever carried a family heirloom and felt its weight was more than physical? Or walked into a grandparent's home and felt a hush that had nothing to do with silence? That's the same current running here, amplified through drums, chants, and ritual. The villagers don't see these acts as optional. Life without ritual would be like farming without tools. Pointless, exhausting, doomed. Just as millet porridge fuels the body, these ceremonies fuel the spirit. Without them, people would feel cut adrift, like a phone that can't find its network. As the last drumbeat fades, the smoke lingers, curling upward into the branches above. People disperse slowly, some thoughtful, others energized, all carrying the sense that their day has been stitched more tightly to the past. And as villagers leave the shrine, the noise that replaces the chants is something far more familiar and human. The chatter of gossip and the playful power of storytelling. Words can strike harder than spears, and nowhere is that truer than when gossip curls through the village like smoke from a stubborn fire. Here's your hook. If you thought Twitter threads or neighborhood Facebook groups were intense, you've clearly never stood in the middle of a pre-colonial African village when tongues start wagging. Information is currency, and everyone spends freely. You linger near a cluster of women pounding grain, the rhythmic thud of pestles underscoring their conversation. One leans closer, lowers her voice just enough to seem conspiratorial, and drops a name. Instantly, shoulders tilt, heads lean, and ears sharpen. Someone allegedly borrowed a goat and hasn't returned it. Another supposedly met a stranger near the forest at night. Facts bend, details stretch, but the story survives because stories here are as vital as food. Not all gossip is malicious. Sometimes it's playful teasing, like ribbing a young man, who tripped at the stream, or a girl whose hair refused to stay plaited during last night's dance. These small jokes soften the edges of life, easing the grind of chores. But gossip can also bite, turning into warnings that ripple across the village. If someone is careless with their crops, cheats in trade, or treats neighbors poorly, their reputation suffers faster than grain spoils in the sun. It's public accountability. No court needed, just sharp tongues and quick ears. Storytelling, though, is where gossip's cousin takes center stage. As dusk approaches and chores wind down, villagers gather around fires, and the tone shifts from whispers to projection. Elders lean forward, their voices low at first, then rising with drama as they spin tales of cunning hares, foolish hyenas, and ancestors whose bravery carved the world you stand on. Each story is a blend of entertainment, moral lesson, and cultural glue. Children sit wide-eyed, toes curling in the dust, while adults nod knowingly at the lessons disguised as adventure. A tale about a greedy hyena hoarding food isn't just funny, it's a warning against selfishness. A story about a clever tortoise outwitting stronger animals reminds everyone that wit matters as much as strength. These aren't bedtime distractions. They are the operating manual of the community, passed down in the only form guaranteed to stick. Memorable stories. Have you noticed how your own family repeats stories at gatherings, embellishing a little more each year? Someone's embarrassing mistake turns into legend, and uncle's exaggeration grows funnier in each retelling. That instinct is the same one at work here, except the stakes are bigger. These tales carry survival strategies, spiritual truths, and moral codes, ensuring no one forgets who they are or where they came from. Reputation, too, is shaped around the fire. A clever remark from an elder might stick in people's minds longer than a week of work in the fields. A sharp joke at someone's expense might shadow them for months. It's no wonder people choose their words carefully, knowing they might live on as the next anecdote. As the firelight flickers on faces and the air fills with laughter, gasps, and applause at the end of a story, you realize you're in the middle of something timeless. Words here don't vanish. They shape, sting, soothe, and build. And among the chatter, one topic inevitably takes hold: courtship, marriage, and the dances that turn glances into alliances. Courtship here doesn't arrive with roses, candlelit dinners, or awkward text messages. It arrives with rhythm, dance, and the kind of side glances that speak volumes without a word. You step into the open square where the air feels different, charged with anticipation. The day's sweat has dried, the market's bustle has quieted, and now the village tilts towards something softer but no less serious: the weaving of families through marriage. It often begins with song. A group of young men gather, their voices threading together in harmonies that rise and fall like waves. Drums join in, steady and insistent, while rattles shake like cicadas in the tall grass. Across from them, young women respond with laughter and steps, their feet brushing dust into the air, skirts swirling just enough to tease but not to reveal. The dance floor isn't polished wood, but the bare earth, and yet it vibrates with more energy than any ballroom chandelier could capture. You watch as glances dart like arrows. A young man takes a bold step toward the girl he's been eyeing all week, clapping in rhythm as he approaches. She pretends not to notice, turns her face slightly, but the corner of her mouth betrays a smile. The entire crowd notices too, erupting in cheers and laughter. In a place where privacy is rare, Romance plays out in public, witnessed, teased, and celebrated. Imagine your crush being announced, not by a private DM, but by a drumbeat loud enough for the whole village to hear. Terrifying, yes, but also thrilling. Marriage here is more than attraction, it's alliance. Families meet, negotiations unfold, and bride wealth, whether in cattle, cloth, or beads, becomes the currency of union. A father might insist on more cattle. A mother might worry about her daughter's workload in the new household, and the negotiations could last days. But behind the numbers and items lies something deeper. The promise that two families will now stand together, sharing burdens and blessings. There's ceremony too. Elders speak blessings, invoking ancestors to witness and guide. Food flows generously, music grows louder, and for one night, the village becomes a stage where love, duty, and future intertwine. And though arranged aspects dominate, choice sneaks in through dances, songs, and stolen looks. Even in a system where marriage strengthens clans, the flutter of young hearts still insists on its place. Modern weddings have their own negotiations, guest lists, budgets, who sits at which table. Here, the debates are about cattle and harvests, but the stress feels oddly familiar. The truth is, whether you're arguing over a seating chart or over how many goats equal a fair bride wealth, you're really negotiating the same thing: respect, fairness, and the hope of a lasting bond. And it's not just the couples who benefit. Weddings ripple outward, strengthening the village itself. They remind everyone that survival depends on unity, and unity depends on bonds, sealed not just in soil or tools, but in blood and vows. As the drums fade and the newly joined families retreat to celebrate privately, another reality presses its way into the village rhythm. What happens when bodies fail? When fever strikes? Or when venom slithers too close? Illness doesn't send polite invitations. It barges in, unannounced, just when the harvest looks promising or the celebrations feel sweetest. You wake one morning, and someone in the compound is shivering, though the sun is already hot, or a child coughs with a rasp that won't quit. In a world without pharmacies, the village turns to its own arsenal: roots, leaves, and the wisdom of those who know how to use them. You follow a healer into the bush, the kind of figure whose knowledge feels both ordinary and mystical. To you, that plant looks like an unremarkable shrub. To them, it's a remedy for fever. Another tree's bark, when boiled, soothes stomach pain. The healer plucks a handful of bitter leaves, crushing them between their palms so that the smell rises sharp and medicinal, like nature's version of menthol. These aren't random guesses. They're the product of generations testing, tasting, and sometimes paying with mistakes. Every cure carries the memory of trial and error etched into it. Back in the village, the sick are treated with mixtures ground in wooden mortars, teas boiled over smoky fires, or poultices pressed gently onto wounds. Some treatments sting, some soothe. All are accompanied by words, chants, prayers, whispered calls to ancestors. Healing here is never just physical, it's spiritual. Illness is seen not only as a breakdown of the body, but as a disturbance in the balance between people, spirits, and the land itself. So, the healer doesn't just hand you a drink. They call for harmony to return. Snake bites, common in the tall grasses, demand urgent remedies. A cut might be made near the wound, herbs applied, and chants spoken over the patient. Fevers, often malaria, though villagers would not have named it as such, are battled with bitter concoctions that children wrinkle their noses at, but swallow anyway because mothers insist. Even broken bones find care. Splints fashioned from wood, bandages of cloth, the patient kept still by watchful family. Modern comparisons are inevitable. Think of how you grab a packet of cold medicine at the first sniffle. Here, you reach instead for the right tree root, boiled carefully, its taste as sharp as its effect. And while you might scroll WebMD for answers, villagers rely on memory and communal trust, confident that their healer's knowledge is both science and inheritance. But sometimes, remedies are not enough. A child weakens, an elder slips away, and grief gathers like a storm cloud. Funerals then take place, not only to mourn, but to ensure the spirit finds its way, that the living release their sorrow properly. Even in death, the connection between body, community, and ancestors must be honored. And yet, more often than not, these herbal cures work well enough to keep life flowing. The village survives fevers, snake bites, and stomach upsets not with hospitals, but with resilience, faith, and the endless creativity of people who refuse to be defeated by their environment. Still, when disputes or accidents break out, illness isn't the only challenge. Justice has its place too, and the village has its own ways of delivering it. Conflict doesn't wait for invitations either. It rises when goats wander into someone else's garden, when trade feels unfair, or when jealousy overflows during a dance. In a village where everyone knows everyone, disputes are as inevitable as sunrise. But here's the thing. Justice doesn't arrive in the form of police cars or courtrooms. It arrives under the shade of a tree, with elders seated on carved stools, and the entire community gathered to listen. You sit cross-legged among others as the latest quarrel is laid bare. A farmer accuses his neighbor of letting cattle trample his millet. The neighbor insists the fence was weak and it isn't his fault. Voices rise, hands wave. But then the elder lifts his hand, and the silence is immediate. His job is not just to settle the fight, but to restore balance, because unresolved grudges here aren't just inconvenient. They can poison the unity the village depends on. Punishments vary, and they often sting more in pride than in body. A fine of goats or grain might be imposed, not to ruin someone, but to repair the harm. Public ridicule is another tool. Being scolded in front of neighbors is its own kind of scar, one that lingers in memory long after bruises would fade. Sometimes disputes end with handshakes, sometimes with side-eye that takes months to soften. But the point is clear. Harmony matters more than victory. Serious offenses, though, call for sterner measures. Theft, repeated lying, or violence might earn harsher fines or exile from the village altogether. Exile is rare, but when it happens, it's devastating. Being cut off from the community here is worse than imprisonment elsewhere. Alone, survival becomes nearly impossible. Imagine being unfriended, not just on social media, but in real life, cut off from food, shelter, and companionship. That's the scale of punishment at stake. There's also the role of spiritual justice. If the elders cannot settle a matter, diviners may be consulted, their rituals and objects providing answers beyond human sight. A goat's entrails, a set of carved bones, or even a trance might reveal who is guilty, who lied, or what the ancestors demand. To the villagers, this isn't superstition. It's a higher court, one less corruptible than human judgment. Interestingly, some disputes are solved with humor, A clever elder might turn accusations into a joke so sharp that both parties laugh in spite of themselves. Laughter releases tension, and the community leaves lighter, restored. Think of it as the ancient version of a skilled mediator cracking the right joke at the right time in a heated meeting. By late afternoon, the quarrel is settled, the fines agreed upon, and life flows back to its normal rhythm. The disputes don't vanish, but they are contained, prevented from splitting the fragile web of community. Justice here isn't about cold laws. It's about keeping a group of humans, animals, and ancestors functioning together. And as the dust settles from arguments and verdicts, another rhythm begins to rise in the distance. The smell of evening meals, the beat of drums, and the promise of moonlit music that pulls everyone back together. Evening settles not with silence, but with appetite. Smoke coils lazily from dozens of hearths, carrying the smell of roasted yams, simmering stews, and ground nut paste bubbling in pots. You drift toward the center of the compound, drawn by the chorus of clinking calabashes and the laughter of neighbors who, just hours ago, might have been arguing over cattle or crops. Hunger, it seems, is the most persuasive peacemaker. The meal is not individual plates, but shared bowls, set in the middle, for hands and spoons to reach. You scoop up a portion of thick porridge, dipping it into stew fragrant with okra and palm oil. The flavors are earthy, smoky, and rich. Not restaurant fancy, but deeply satisfying. Each bite tells you about the day's labor. The cassava dug from fields, the firewood collected in the morning, the herbs crushed by careful hands. You don't just eat food here, you eat memory and effort. Children chatter while shoveling food into their mouths, pausing only to argue over who got the biggest piece of meat. Dogs linger at the edge of the circle, eyes wide with shameless hope, while goats bleat indignantly as if jealous of the attention. The meal becomes theater. People joking, teasing, telling fragments of stories while chewing. One elder recalls the last harvest. Another mimics the clumsy way a boy chased a runaway calf earlier. Everyone laughs, and for a moment, the burdens of survival dissolve into pure human joy. As the bowls empty, another sound replaces the clinking. Drums. At first, a steady beat, like a heartbeat amplified. Then faster, layered with rattles, voices, and the stamping of feet. The firelight glows against bodies that begin to sway, then leap, then whirl with abandon. You join the crowd as dancers form a circle, each person stepping into the center to show their moves while others clap in rhythm. Young men test their stamina with high kicks and daring flips. Young women respond with graceful turns and laughter that seems to shake the very stars. Music here is not background, it is lifeblood. The songs carry history, mocking old enemies, praising ancestors, or simply celebrating the absurdities of daily life. Someone improvises a verse about the goat that interrupted children's games earlier, and the whole crowd roars with laughter. This is culture preserved not in books, but in rhythm, memory etched into beats rather than ink. If you've ever been to a family wedding where the music grows louder, shoes are abandoned, and even the shyest cousin is dragged to the dance floor, you already understand the mood. Except here, no DJ is needed. The instruments are hands, drums, rattles, and voices, and the floor is dust glowing silver under moonlight. Hours slip by unnoticed. The moon arcs higher. Stars scatter like spilled salt. And still, the music refuses to fade. Children eventually nod off on mats at the edge of the fire, lulled by rhythm instead of bedtime stories. Adults dance, sing, and laugh until breathless because tomorrow's labor hasn't arrived yet, and tonight belongs to celebration. And when the last drumbeat finally subsides, you retreat toward your hut, body tired, belly full, ears still humming with echoes. Sleep waits beneath the thatch roof, carrying you toward dreams that stitch today into tomorrow. The hut greets you with shadows and silence, a cool contrast to the fiery energy of the evening square. You duck beneath the low doorway, the scent of smoke still clinging to your hair, and stretch out on a mat woven from reeds. The thatch above rustles softly in the breeze, as if whispering secrets between the grass blades. Outside, the faint beat of the last drum lingers, now more memory than music. Slowly, the hum of crickets takes over, steady and patient, like nature's lullaby. You close your eyes, but the day still replays itself in fragments. The rooster's obnoxious cry at dawn, the careful balance of the water pot on your head, the sting of smoke in your eyes while feeding the fire, the laughter shared over porridge, the ache of swinging the hoe in the sun, the sparks of the blacksmith's hammer, the chaos of the market, the mischief of children, the solemn rhythm of ritual, the sharp edge of gossip, the charged glances at the dance, the healer's bitter medicine, the stern but fair judgments under the tree, the feast and music of the evening. All of it stitches into a tapestry you carry into your sleep. The mat beneath you is thin, but it holds you the way Earth always does, steady and uncomplaining. A clay pot of water rests nearby, cool insurance against thirst in the middle of the night. Somewhere in the corner, a baby stirs, murmurs, and then quiets again as its mother soothes it with a whispered hum. The sounds of life never vanish completely. They soften, turning from clamor into comfort. Your body aches in the honest way that only labor can create, muscles stretched and tested, but the ache feels earned. Tomorrow will demand the same chores: the firewood, the water, the fields, the gossip, the rituals, the meals. But tonight, you surrender to rest. Dreams here are not idle fantasies. They are conversations. You might dream of ancestors offering guidance, of fields bursting green, of children laughing in future seasons. Dreams stretch across time, binding what has been to what will be. If you've ever fallen asleep after a long day of work, bone-tired but oddly content, you know this feeling. That deep exhale, that soft unraveling of thought, that surrender to rest. It's the same here, only wrapped in the hum of insects and the glow of moonlight slipping through the cracks in the wall. The village breathes with you, every hut holding its own stories, every family sinking into its own dreams. The day's heat has passed. Tomorrow's tasks have not yet arrived. And for now, you float in the rarest luxury this life can offer: peace. And so, chosen traveler, your day in the village drifts to a close. You have woken with the rooster, walked to the stream, worked the fields, tasted porridge, laughed at gossip, and danced beneath the moon. You've seen how every rhythm of life, water, fire, food, work, story, ritual, fits together like threads in a woven mat. Nothing is wasted, nothing is rushed, everything belongs. Let that truth rest on your heart tonight. That life, in its simplest form, can be whole, rich, and deeply human. As you lie back now, let the memory of drums fading into crickets carry you toward dreams, slow and steady, until your own world dissolves gently into sleep.